and welcome to Himalayan Crossroads, a podcast series on the youngest, tallest, and most dynamic mountain range of the world. This is the first episode, New Beginnings of our very first season, Mountains and Mythologies. Welcome.
Thank you, Swati. In our first season, but also throughout the podcast, we're very excited to look at the concept of Himalayan Crossroad, not only in its local and regional context, but also in its broader national as well as transnational history and contemporary present. Maybe before we start, we should start with introductions, though.
Sure, why not?
Swati, I know that your project is very exciting and I've learned so much from it, and I'm also thrilled to share this with the world. So could you tell us a little bit more about your thesis?
Sure, thank you. Hello, I am Swati Chauhan, a doctoral student at the School of Religious Studies in McGill University. I work with South Asian religious traditions, and my doctoral research is on goddess worship in Kashmir.
Wow, that's fascinating. And because I know this personally, I know that you're working with many languages. Like, there's a huge philological aspect to the work that you're engaging with. Could you talk a little bit more about your primary and secondary languages?
Sure, I could go on about this for hours. I would try the shorter version though. My primary research language is Sanskrit, but because it is Kashmir, I'm working with the Sharda and the Nagari scripts. And in addition to that, I am bringing in primary and secondary material in Hindi, Urdu, and English. I'm not sure about others, but there are materials like from Marathi in the background. But it's still a project in formation, so it keeps changing, but that's my current status. And I'm excited about this work, and hopefully some of it will seep into our podcast later.
Absolutely.
But that's about me. What about you, Sainiko? Tell us about your project.
Thank you, Swati. I'm also doing my PhD at McGill, specifically at the Department of English, but I'm looking at literatures beyond the Anglophone, although it's mostly constituted of Anglophone texts. So I look at the contemporary literary representation of landscape, specifically of the Eastern Himalaya. I look at how these ideas of the landscape shapes our questions of belonging as well as unbelonging.
You mentioned the word literatures, and what literatures are you working with? Is it about literary form?
That's a good question, because I think that brings in so many different factors. Definitely literary form is one of them, and each time I talk about it, each time I bring up proposals, I add new forms. So definitely novel is one aspect of it, which is probably the most dominant contemporary literary form. But apart from that, I'm also looking at poetry, I'm looking at short stories, I'm looking at epic, and also how all of these literary forms are in conversation with each other throughout history and shape and influence each other with the global literary market as well.
Wow, all the best for the project. And I'm really glad that we're doing this podcast together, because now I'll get to learn from your expertise and about a new field that I'm not engaging in with myself personally.
Likewise. I think what's really exciting is that both of us are working on different parts of the Himalaya, and at the same time, like, as much as we talk and we research, we find out that there are such commonalities as well as such distinct specificities depending on the region, depending on its history, its language, and the climate.
Exactly, and there's a lot more to learn about this beyond academia and the classic working with text as well. For example, collaborating with Marjingba, a young emerging musician who we collaborated with for our podcast. And we have a very cool story about that for you, Sainiko. Would you like to share about your interactions with Marjingba?
Sure. Thank you, Swati. I think for us, it was very crucial. As we're talking about busting stereotypes and busting myths, we wanted to also highlight probably parts of music, of arts and culture that might be underrepresented from the region. And I think the Pena music is one of them. And the Pena music is what you heard at both the introduction as well as the outro of our trailers, of any reel, any music, as well as this episode as well. So Marjing Mayang Lambam, he's an emerging artist, and he's a fabulous Pena player, as you must have heard. He's someone who who I realize has worked with it right from his childhood. So he's someone who can really speak a lot about its historic, traditional, ritual roots. The Pena music for me is something that I've heard more in the context of ritual, so during Lai Haraba festival. And it's very fascinating to take it in the context now where it's outside of the domain of sacred, but in the domain of the podcast, domain of like public outreach and community engagement.
Wonderful. Well, as Sainik already knows, I'm already a fan of marching band, and I cannot wait for the audience to interact with this music again. But before we move forward, what is this instrument Pena that you have been mentioning about?
Yeah. So actually, I was just going to mention Marjing Mayang Lambam. His Instagram account is Marjing Ba, and you can find his music on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Music, anywhere. I really recommend giving a listen, supporting the artists, as well as like folk music. The Pena is a traditional instrument which belongs to the chordophone family, so which means it's a stringed instrument that's fixed on either end, and then it has a sound box or a resonator at one end. So the Pena specifically, the body is made of bamboo, and then the resonator is made of coconut shell, like dry coconut shell, and then the bow has elements from horsehair, like it's made of horsehair, and it has little bells at the end, so it jingles, so there's this very distinct sound that you hear. So the Pena is an instrument that's used in rituals by the Meitei of Manipur. So as I mentioned earlier, there's Lai Harauba, there's in music, there's a lot of, apart from the Lai Harauba as well, you'll see it in the folk dances, you'll see it in any sort of performance. It's gone beyond the context of ancient ritual. But I think there's a lot of effort right now to popularize it, and I hope the podcast is also one of those avenues to do that as well.
Wow, wonderful. And I feel the diversity that the Pena music and collaborating with Marjing Ba that comes through our podcast is really wonderful, because that speaks to how we understand the Himalaya, how we are understanding our title and the concept Himalayan Crossroads.
Absolutely. And I think as much as we're talking about the music, which is so crucial to our project and this idea of bringing different elements together, as academics, I think we also have to bring the question of definition, the question of structure. It's something that's really hard to do, but we're going to attempt to bring down the etymology to question of the region and the landscape. So Swati, can you tell us a little bit more about the etymology?
Sure. I mean, the word Himalaya, it's Hima, which literally means snow, one of the words for snow, and Alaya, which is an abode or a place, and this comes from Sanskrit. So the word Himalaya is an abode of snow. And we find words like Himavat or Himavan in the Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic, and which basically just mean the same thing, that this is a place which has a lot of snow. And in different contemporary Indic languages, we find various iterations of the word, which are kind of similar to Himalaya, all indicating that this is the abode of snow in this part of the world.
Yeah. And I was also thinking that our popular idea has always remained of the snow-capped peaks, right? The abode of snow. But I think the Himalaya, growing up in school, we were always taught that it has several ranges, right?
Of course, the Western Himalaya and the Eastern Himalaya.
Yes, you have the Western Himalaya, you have the Eastern Himalaya, and I think just for the sake of definition, normatively we see it as the Nanga Parbat, so around Pakistan side, and Namcha Barwa, which is in Tibet. But the Himalayas goes beyond those ranges. It goes both laterally, horizontally as well. So you can see it extend towards the Trans-Himalayan region. You can also see within the Himalaya, you have different ranges. So you have the Shivalik, which is the lower range, and then you have the Himachal, which is slightly higher, and then you have the Himadri, which is what you're talking about, which has a much more alpine conditions, like constant snow, eternal snow in that sense. But within the Himalaya, there's just so much diversity, because as we're talking about it as an abode of snow, but that's probably limited to areas that have higher altitude, right? Which is also more specific, perhaps, to not just the Western, but also the Central Himalaya, whereas the Eastern Himalaya has some of the wettest regions of the world. It's classified, I think, as a evergreen, one of the 30 biodiversity hotspots in the world, and also the place where so many rivers, like life-giving, life-affirming, major rivers of the entire subcontinent rises from.
Of course, and Meghalaya always comes to the mind. Meghalaya, the abode or the place of Megha, the clouds. So it's literally a mountain range with diverse climates as we move, whether horizontally or vertically. And oh my God, this brings very distant memory to the mind. Like we were just literally revising our high school geography classes.
Yeah.
Oh, those were good days.
Those were good days.
Yes. And as you were talking, definitely the most dominant concepts of the Himalaya is about it as the snow-capped mountains, the abode of gods, where the gods live, where tranquility can be found. And that's the idea for which a lot of ascetics, holy men and women, and rishis, they climb up these peaks, they undertake arduous penances and endure hardships to gain supernatural powers.
I was just thinking about that because as much as we were talking about high school and what we've learned about the structure, popularly the idea of the Himalaya is a place of meditation.
Of
right?
course.
It's a place of tranquility, of pristine beauty, almost like a standstill place outside of time, outside of region, where you go for spiritual rejuvenation as well.
Of course, it's the place where all yogis go. It's the place where you go Rishikesh for yoga and meditation boot camps.
Yeah, and I was actually just thinking about this whole idea of boot camps and Rishikesh. I mean, I can't help think about this, but the Beatles have been so crucial to this image of, going east, in quotes, like going east in order to find yourself, in order to take a break from the hardships of producing and creating this very hard, the labor market, right? Like they've been on world tours as well. And so they go to this meditation camp, which is, I think, what was the name? So it was a specific kind of transcendental meditation. Yes, this was in 1968.
Yeah.
And so they go on, and then they go on to popularize this idea of if you go there and you take a break and you find a different version of yourself, that's outside of this hustle culture, that's outside of the pressures of the market.
And I mean, it's not just limited to the Beatles themselves. The legacy continues. Of course, they left behind the Beatles Cafe and the Beatles Ashram, but we know from personal experience and from friends and colleagues and the travel blogs and tourists and yogis writing and publishing about their experience, you definitely go to the Himalayas to find your truest self, to find the voices you have kept silent within you. People go on writing retreats, work retreats, or it's just a famous tourist destination.
Absolutely. So this idea that, it's a tourist destination, it's a place outside of, urban, rural, it's outside of these divisions. But from our experience, we know that the Himalaya is full of very rich human history, full of communities that have been living through actually sometimes very difficult circumstances, right? Like whether, as much as we're talking about its pristine beauty, it's also a place of harsh climate. It's also a place of harsh weather conditions, and often this cannot be put down to environmental determinism, because often this harshness comes from unplanned development projects, comes from infrastructure projects that we see now has caused so much of, whether that's landslides, whether that's flooding across the Himalaya.
Of course, and as we are sitting and talking right now, and the past few months have been devastating for people living along and across the Himalaya. Talk about northern Pakistan, talk about Jammu and Kashmir, and even up till the plains in the Punjab. The area has been ravaged by constant floods and landslides. We sincerely hope and pray that situation improves for them. But as you were saying, it's true. Even the current station.
Sorry, I just want to add that you're right.
Of course,
you're right. But also, as much as there's been floods in those parts, I feel like I must be that person. The Eastern Himalaya also, as well as the Central Himalaya, they've been facing floods, recurring floods, devastating floods, landslides across Assam, across Manipur, Arunachal, Sikkim. All of these places have seen vast changes in the way, in not just precipitation patterns, but also soil patterns, in terms of weather patterns. And this is, like you were mentioning, it's not always only the difficult weather or unpredictable weather conditions. A lot of this is predictable due to unplanned development projects.
Exactly, and that goes well with the current station of critical disasters studies, which put forth the idea that these are not natural disaster, but man-made disaster or human-made disasters, because when they unfold and the experience of a disaster is subject to different factors like unchecked development, like socioeconomic inequalities, because the worst hit are always the economically poor, the marginalized, the peripheralized people.
Absolutely, yes. No, I just wanted to add to that because you're so right about this idea of how we've naturalized natural disaster without really looking at the category of how man-made these natural disasters are, because so much of the work that, so much of what we're seeing, the contemporary unpredictableness is totally predictable by the amount of data that we have, by the amount of satellite information, by the amount of, like how much statistics has helped in order to guess what's going to happen. It's no longer even guessing, it can be calculated, and yet we go on to do quote-unquote development projects. There's actually a term for this, I'm forgetting, but there's Rob Nixon, he calls them developmental refugees. So in the sense that, and we need to really interrogate this idea of development. What does it mean? Who gets to benefit from it? Because like you mentioned, it's usually underrepresented groups. It's usually invisibilized, marginalized groups that really bear the largest brunt of these projects as well.
Yes, I feel this is a good moment to pause and convey that we both are going to bring in our friendly rivalries that comes through when we're talking about our projects, of talking about the eastern Himalayas and the western Himalayas.
No, that's true. And I think this is why this idea of crossroads becomes so crucial.
Exactly.
Because you're going to see them as a melting pot of like entangling different practices. And we really, I think for me, I learned so much from your insights as well.
And it comes to my mind that in many Indic languages, and specifically in Hindi, Urdu, and Haryanvi, which I grew up with, the idea of the crossroads, the idea of Chauraha, of four paths coming across, it's the space where nobody stops. It's a place of constant migrations, of people moving, of people coming and doing their business. So it's basically a frontier zone. It's basically a space which is in constant flux, so we'll bring in the idea of Himalaya as the frontier, and we'll also problematize the idea of thinking of frontier as something that's distant from the center.
Yeah. No, that's so important to look at it as a frontier, because historically this is not true only of the Himalaya, but mountains in general, the landscape has always been seen as a natural frontier. So you'll see a lot of the imagination, national imagination of several countries is usually articulated in terms of landscape, you know, whether that's oceans that are surrounding it, whether that's mountains that are surrounding it. So this idea of frontier as a natural frontier, and then with the birth of the modern nation state, this is naturalized as a national frontier, right? And so this idea, so it goes beyond the question of periphery, because you'll always have these antagonisms, or you'll have this conflict between who benefits or who gets to exploit or who gets to extract from peripheral and metropolitan conversations. But the frontier as a category, as a bureaucratic administrative category, is what amplifies those tensions, I believe. And I think part of our project, as by calling it Himalayan Crossroads, is to reclaim that identity, to not put it only as a frontier, but to see it in its vast richness beyond a specific category as well.
Exactly. And I feel that's where we put forth our aims very explicitly, that we would be contesting the notion of Himalaya as the roof of the world, because that really, and I mean, of course, it's a stereotype. There lies more things behind the surface level investigations that we see popularly, but also the idea that it's only referring to the tip of the iceberg. Himalaya and cultures, histories along the Himalaya are so much more than it just being a static, pristine landscape, which is the receptacle of beauty.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I really like the idea of what you mentioned, it as a place that we see as a frontier, and really how to unsee that or how to rethink that imagination. Because one way to look at it also is to see it as an idea of borderlands, right? Because these are regions that have seen so much of migration and fluidity, and you'll see, I think what I was reading, almost everyone in this region, because it's so rich in trade routes, was multilingual, and everybody's speaking at least 4 languages, because there are so many communities. It's at the hub of centers of, whether that's South Asia, whether that's East Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, and beyond Asia, right? Like you have so many trade routes that come in this nodal point, and then you have this plurality of not just languages, but of religious beliefs, of ethnicities, of national identities, and it's something that it's also undergoing even now as well. So I think that's what, like for me as well, like this project is going to be highlighting and exemplifying in that sense.
Of course. Moving on, and in the further episodes, we'll be complicating notions of the Himalaya as the frontier, the Himalaya as a periphery, and the Himalaya as a place of beauty. And I personally am very invested in exploring and complicating the idea of the Himalaya as beautiful, because as someone who is working on Kashmir and keeps on learning about it, coming across authors, coming across professors and thinkers writing and complicating the idea of beauty with respect to the Kashmirian landscape is something that I'm very invested in.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think the question of beauty to me is also what we see it as sublime. So it's beauty, but it's also awe-inspiring with a touch of terror. I am paraphrasing here, but a lot of representation, a lot of written work about the Himalaya complicates this idea of not just beauty that you can stare and admire, but beauty that terrifies you, or it invokes a sense of sublime in you. But we're going to talk about that. We have some amazing guests lined up who are experts in this field and who will be telling us more about this question of beauty and aesthetics that defines the Himalaya. So,
of course, and you were speaking, oh my God, I would keep the can of worms in my brain aside, because who's it beautiful for, the insider or the outsider? Is it an etic or an emic view? But for now, yes, that's what major aims of our podcast are about. In short, we'll be pushing back against the colonial, the oriental, and deep-seated notions of Himalaya as a static, pristine landscape.
Definitely. So stay tuned for more.
But before we go, I feel we should leave all our guests and viewers with another friendly rivalry of ours, which we have been contesting ourselves for long. Is it Himalaya or the Himalayas?
This is so crucial, and I think you and I had the best time discussing this.
There have been constant back and forth, even after us launching our podcast on different social media platforms and outreach platforms, with Sainiku coming and knocking at my door. It's Himalaya and not Himalayas.
Absolutely. So I think this makes sense because both of them are correct. I just want to underline that both of them are widely used phrases, and at the same time, because like you mentioned, right, like Himalaya as the abode of snow is already a plural term. And at the same time, when it's translated or not translated, when it's used in English, when you're using plural, you put an S. So, everything adds an S or an ES depending on the word in order to denote its plurality. So, but words like pajama become pajamas, momo becomes momos, Himalaya becomes Himalayas. And so for me, I think I wanted to stick with Himalaya because I thought the word itself brings to the fore its plurality. But Swati, you were also right that now it's in a different context itself, so we have to be able to use it as Himalayas.
I mean, that's the complexity of having the word, having a term, a non-English term become an Anglophone term. Like, the words like guru, mantra, which I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot because these are what comes to mind when we're talking of the Himalaya.
Absolutely. And I think what I really love is how much we keep learning from each other.
Every single bit of this is the best thing that we have done.
That we've done so far. Yeah. So yes, please stay tuned for more.
And we'll see you in the next episode. Meanwhile,
like, share, and subscribe
to our podcast. Take care.
Bye.